Thank you for joining us in our discourse today on Pope Benedict, Life and Work and Legacy. Today we have with us Dr. Rudolf J. Siebert, Professor Emeritus from Western Michigan University, Department of Comparative Religion, where he taught for over 50 years. He's the founder and director of two international courses, one on the future of religion in Dubrovnik, Croatia, and the other on religion and civil society in Yalta, Ukraine, in the Crimea. He has written dozens of books and hundreds of articles on the critical theory of the Frankfurt School, Hegel, political theology, psychology of religion, and has developed over the course of the last 50 plus years the critical theory of religion and society. He's recently published a book, Hegel and the Critical Theory of Religion, with Ekperosis Press, and is currently working on a book on the authoritarian personality. He's a member of the Institute for Critical Social Theory, which was founded in 2021. So welcome, Dr. Siebert.
Good morning.
So today we're going to talk about Pope Benedict, who just a couple weeks ago on New Year's Eve passed away. And so we want to talk a little bit at his life, and we're going to go through the stages of his life, his early life, and later as a priest and a professor into being an administrator, and later into the Papacy. So, Dr. Siebert, you have many commonalities with Joseph Ratzinger. You were both born in 1927, him in Markel am Inn in southern Bavaria, and you in Frankfurt am Main in the state of Hesse. You were both raised as devout Catholics. You both grew up in the Third Reich, and you both were required to participate in the Hitler Youth, which both of you resisted. You were both in the Luftwaffenhelfer, the anti-aircraft corps, and then in the Wehrmacht. However, Ratzinger eventually deserted while you continued to fight in defense of the women and children of your country. Later, you were both sent to prisoner of war camps, you to Camp Allen in the United States, and Ratzinger to New Ulm, and then to Fliegerhorst Bad Aibling. After the war, you both eventually went to seminary, wherein Ratzinger was later ordained and lived in celibacy, while you chose to go into academia in the United States and to marry and have a family. Ratzinger did his dissertation and his habilitation work on Augustine of Hippo and Bonaventure, and you did yours on the working class and reform-minded Bishop of Mainz, Michael Helding. Dr. Siebert, your similar life experiences would suggest that you may have some insights into Joseph Ratzinger's life, his career in the church, that others like me might not simply grasp. We see him decontextualized in many ways outside of history, where you share a lot of that history with him. How do you think his experiences with say, German fascism or being born and being raised in the Third Reich and the rise of the Nazis, how that prepared him for a life in the church and in the positions he took in the church?
Yeah, it certainly influenced both of us, what we experienced, and that was a lot in young age. In 1927, when we were born, that was just a year or so before the Great Depression. So our families had a hard time. And then, of course, the question is if all the reporting is adequate. So, for instance, Joseph Ratzinger said that he never went to the Hitler Youth. That's not possible. You were forced to go to the Hitler Youth. So if you did not appear, then the leader came or the police came. So that was obligatory. Every Wednesday and every Saturday you had to appear there. So, but of course, I think we both tried to get out of it as much as possible. So I had a good friend who was a leader even in the Hitler Youth, but he protected me. He put me into an office, and so I didn't have to go to the military exercises, and I didn't have to listen to the fascist lectures and so on. So this kind of protection I could get, and I tried to stay out as much as possible. But fundamentally, everybody had to go. Once I told my brother, a younger brother, my father had died from cancer, and I had to take care of him. He was 2 years younger, and I said, well, don't go to the Hitler Youth today. Do your Latin, that will help you in later life. They will not last very long. Well, my brother went to the Hitler Youth. He was very angry and said, my brother didn't let me go. He said, you will not last very long. Well, reaction was quite promptly. The governor of the state of Hessen right away cut my school money. And so I would have to stop with my humanistic high school, an elite high school with Latin and Greek and Hebrew, and I loved it. So on a power through joy trip, my mother on the Rhine River went to the director of a shoe factory who had replaced the Jewish owner. And she went to him and said, now I cannot pay for this. This is more expensive than my whole income and so on. So he listened to her very quietly and then said, we'll pay for it. So the fascist shoe factory paid what the fascist governor had to take away. But later on, when I had shut down 12 bombers who attacked Frankfurt, then I got it all back again. I was recognized as a patriotic person. So that was with the Hitler Youth, that one could not really avoid it. And then with the dissertation, with the dispersion rather, it was rather that the German army disintegrated in 1945 in March and April. And so it was rather that the army deserted the individual than the individual deserted the army. But if he really deserted, and if that was serious, then he knew more than I did, because the only way how one could desert morally was if the government was so corrupt, so rotten that one could not serve it any longer. But the German government, the Reich government, was in Berlin, was recognized by the neutrals, and he was even recognized by the belligerent people, by the enemies in London and in Paris and so on. As a matter of fact, the government was recognized up into May 1945, when Dönitz took over the government and signed the armistice. And suddenly, after the armistice, they found out suddenly that they were no government anymore. So then the government ceased, and then one could, of course, desert. But at the time when Ratzinger was supposed to have deserted, there was still a legitimate government, no matter how criminal. And he could not know about most of the crimes. The death camps, that was all secret. That was not known to the average soldier. So these are little things, little historical data, which one can, of course, discuss. Then, of course, he decided after the seminary then to be ordained, and I decided not to be ordained. And the reason was after we went through the seminaries at the same time, then I wrote my dissertation still on Erasmian, a humanist, a bishop. There were Protestant and Catholic humanists in 1530 to 1540 who tried to get the two churches together. They followed Erasmus of Rotterdam, who was supposed to become the real Luther, but he was a tender soul and he was not up for the rough fighting in the streets. So therefore, he did not become the Luther. But there were these Erasmians, and Thomas More belonged to them. Even Henry VIII belonged to them for some time. And so I was very interested because they were willing not only to oppose the Reformation, but to reform themselves. So for about 3 years, there was no celibacy. For about 3 years, the lay chalice was given to the lay people and so on. So the reforms started, but then they were repressed somehow by the Jesuit counter-reformation, which took the southern part of Europe. And so only the northern part became Protestant. And then North America became Protestant and Latin America became Catholic. So nevertheless, it was this group which fascinated me, and I studied it in all detail, the concessions they would make to the reformers. So then I heard only very late about the causes of the Reformation. Of course, for 400 years, the Roman Catholic Church taught that it was Wycliffe or Hus or Luther or Calvin or so, who were the bad people who made the Reformation, which split the whole Western Church and so on. But it was my doctor father, Joseph Lotz, who the first time discovered that it was really the ruin of the church before the Reformation, which motivated all these reformers to do something about it and to stop it and so on. So it was really the horrible conditions in which Catholicism found itself in the beginning of the 16th century, which brought about all these reformers. So that was the real cause. And I think Catholics have to take responsibility for that. There was a German Pope right during the Reformation who did take responsibility for it, but he only lived 6 weeks longer. So, but otherwise the prejudice was the reformers did that to Western Catholicism, that it fell apart. So my reason for, after I wrote the dissertation, I still went to the States and I studied for a year at Catholic University. And so I studied leadership. It continued my education, which I received in the prisoner of war camp, in terms of the, we were supposed to transform the fascist state into a liberal state. So motivated by the Frankfurt School and the New School in New York, the Roosevelt administration recognized that not all Germans had been Nazis. And so they chose 25,000 German prisoners and identified them as anti-Nazis out of 300,000. And they were educated. And I received that education. And then a few years later, that was reinforced by a study on leadership at Catholic University. So after that, I made the decision not to let myself be ordained. And I think the reason, to sum it all up, was the authoritarian character of the institution, and I could not see myself as one of those authoritarians in an authoritarian structure. And I had all my education since Camp Allen was in democracy, democratic state, democratic family, democratic civil society, and so on. So therefore, on this basis, I asked for my laicization and received it right away. And the bishop then later on just ordained, then of course married us, as they say. So he blessed our marriage, Margit and mine, in Catholic college in Germany, and the college celebrated the wedding very nicely and beautifully. So my departure from the seminary was rather peaceful. And all those my friends who had a similar democratic orientation and were ordained, they all got in trouble later on, including Hans Küng and Johannes Baptist Metz or Gregory Baum, and so on and so on and so on. So this was, I have never regretted my decision.
Yeah, so I mean, Dr. Then to become, of course, Benedict had the similar type of situations, but where you went through the more democratic side and into academia, he goes into academia, into theology, and goes into becoming a professor within the church, which he is, from what I understand, a professor in the church from 1951 to 1977. And as a professor of theology, he took part in Vatican II, the Reform Council called for by Pope John the 23rd, which took place from 1962 to 1965. And with others like Karl Rahner and who you've already mentioned, Hans Küng, Joseph Ratzinger supported the German bishops with more innovative theology during the Vatican II Council, arguing for a church with its windows open to the world. Yet Ratzinger seemed to change his mind about Vatican II soon after, especially when he was a professor at Tübingen, where he experienced the anti-war Third Youth Movement, often called the 1968 generation, who were calling for revolutionary change in Germany and the West in general, in many ways from a Marxian perspective or Marxist perspective. What about those experiences in Tübingen made Ratzinger sour on the liberal reforms? Was it because he was targeted by students for protest, as was Kung and Adorno and many others, or was there something in the Vatican liberal, quote unquote, liberal reforms that he really regretted?
Well, I think all these people who consulted or helped the bishops during the council, so Gregory Baum was also among them. He counseled them on the race question, that means the relationship of Roman Catholicism to Judaism. He was a Jew and had written his dissertation about the issue. So he helped Cardinal Beer, the German cardinal, chose him as a consultant. And so Hans Küng the same way. So at that time, they were all in friendly relationships. And for some time, there was the idea that Joseph Ratzinger had become authoritarian or right-wing later on, and that he was still on the liberal side during the council or so. Maybe one could say that he was more on the liberal side as far as the liturgical reforms were concerned. I think he was for it, but not so far as the council went. And so I think that he grew up in a very conservative and right-wing area in southern Bavaria, which borders on Austria. And there was this southern German nationalism, which was different from the, admittedly different from the National Socialism, which Hitler then promoted, but they were not too far apart from each other. So I think that he grew up in a rather authoritarian family and authoritarian area politically, and that this was his personality structure, I think, from the very start. Now, he was very friendly very often, and so I knew many authoritarian personalities who were very friendly and so on. So that must not, somehow get in the way of a real analysis of the situation. So, I mean, authoritarian people are not bad people. They want to rescue Europe. They want to rescue a Christian Europe. They want to rescue the Western civilization and so on and so on. So, and I knew fascists, Nazis who had a rather human face. My professor in philosophy in Mainz, he came to examine me once in the seminary, and he was an unbelievably friendly person. But in the Hitler time, he was a journalist. And as a journalist, I heard him on the radio, how he praised the German air attack on the capital of Serbia. So, and he was enthusiastic about it, how the bombs were falling and how beautiful the fire came up and so on. And now after the war, he changed around and was now a professor for scholastic philosophy and had become very friendly. As a matter of fact, he had been friendly already when he described the bombardment of Belgrade. So, so there one has to differentiate between the outside and the inside and whatever. Okay, so that I would somehow put into question if Joseph Ratzinger was a democratic personality or whatever from the very start. I think that all these people who consulted the bishops, that they were friends to each other, and his job, which he got in Tübingen, he got through Hans Küng and through Metz and so on. So then the lines were drawn in the sand, so to speak, when after the council reaction set in, and people who had been very conservative through the council already then asserted themselves, and some went to the extreme, like the pious group there who had to be excommunicated even because of their right-wing situation, their racism, their anti-Semitism, and their denial of the Holocaust and all these issues. So I think it came maybe a decade or two that all this came into the open. By 1978, on Christmas, Hans Küng suddenly was sentenced not to be, was sentenced and punished, and could not speak as a Catholic theologian anymore. So one of the great Catholic theologians could not speak anymore as a Catholic theologian. And over 90 scholars were then either by the Cardinal Ratzinger or by the Pope Benedict XVI, they were taken out of their office and were condemned and so on. So it was a real slaughter which took place. And it became more and more the confrontation between those who were more democratic and more egalitarian and more for freedom and so on, and the others who were the opposite, that they fell apart.
Yeah, in 1977, Ratzinger is appointed the Archbishop of Munich and Freisling and by Pope Paul VI. He went from being primarily a Catholic theologian as a professor to an administrator of the church, wherein his very conservative nature, I think, became increasingly clear in that time. From my reading of history, this administrative job seemed to be at odds with his nature, not his views at the time, which, as you said, are very increasingly conservative, and it's questionable whether he was ever democratic in that sense. But his nature seems to be very quiet, reflective, kind of a bookwormish theologian. And actually, when he's called to be administrator, this is, he's ambivalent about it. And in fact, in an interview, he even invoked St. Augustine's weeping at his consecration because he too would have rather remained a theologian buried in a library as opposed to doing this clerical administrative work. So do you think being an administrator was an ill fit for Ratzinger?
Well, I think he had a certain contemplative tendency, and he liked to study and liked to write books. And he very often said it when he was the, what is the title? These titles, St. Peter would have had a hard time with these titles. So he was the prefect of the Congregation of the Doctrine of Faith, which was the former Inquisition. And so for a long time, and sometimes people asked him, if he wanted to retire or whatever. He said, yes, I want to retire. And twice I tried to retire, but I cannot go to the Pope and say, I want to retire and want to write books or whatever. But in spite of these confessions against administration, I think he enjoyed it in a certain way. You cannot go on for 20 years in an office and hate it all the time. So I think he had these talents, for scholarship, but I think he had some administrative talents as well. If you look at them from an authoritarian perspective in an authoritarian church, because Catholicism became more and more authoritarian, the more the pressure from outside, the Enlightenment movement and so on, threatened its existence. So there is even a justification why it became authoritarian. Democracy is harder to deal with when you are in a crisis situation. We see that now today, where people very often say democracy doesn't work and want to have an authoritarian fellow who becomes some kind of a magical helper who will solve all the problems. So, no, I think he had both qualities, and from an authoritarian personality point of view, he did a good job, you could say, even as inquisitor. And then also he had another function there, the president of the commission to draft the catechism of the Catholic Church, which came out later on. And there's an interesting thing that we had Father Harden here, a Jesuit, who was my predecessor at Western Michigan University. And he was a collaborator of President Ratzinger. He worked very closely with him in creating that new catechism, which has these authoritarian tendencies as well still, and therefore had trouble to be accepted by these more liberal scholars which came up. So, but the Father Harden was of the same character. He had been in Rome and had an illness, and then was sent back to Chicago and Detroit, and then came here. And the Western Michigan University wanted to establish a theology department, which constitutionally was not possible. And I don't know how Miller and Siebert and so on could dare to do this. They were all Presbyterian, good Presbyterians, and they just tried. I cannot imagine that they didn't know. So therefore, there was a rabbi invited and Protestant scholars, and then Father Harden was the Catholic, the first Catholic priest ever hired by a state university. And so then I came. Father Harden went to the Jesuits in Baltimore, where I taught, and they thought I was a good fit for this job. And so he was the one who brought me here. But soon I discovered that we had difficulties and differences. There was a young priest from Holland who had some kind of a Mariology, which was not entirely orthodox. And so Father Harden right away went to Detroit and got the rights of an inquisitor and did the Inquisition when the young priest was being made ready for a brain operation here in the Borges Hospital. And so the night before, he asked him all these painful questions which an inquisitor asks. And later on, I asked Father Harden, I said, how could you do that? The man was in this condition. Couldn't you wait a little bit and so on? And he started weeping. And I thought that he regretted deeply what he had done to his brother priest. But he did not weep because of that. He wept because the priest had shared his sufferings with a layman, and that was not supposed to happen. So this is an incident which shows what the authoritarian personality is like when it appears in the clergy. And so then Father Harden was let go by Western Michigan University. And it was a public scandal. It was on the newspapers in Detroit. And later on, Father Harden wrote that I had voted also against him, that he would not get tenure, and which was not true. And in the meantime, Father Harden is supposed to become canonized, become a saint of the Catholic Church in St. Louis diocese. And I wrote to the Jesuits that this, before he becomes holy, that they should correct this mistake, or that I had voted against him. In spite of the fact that I was not on the right as he was, I would not have voted against him because of that or whatever. So the reality was, first of all, it was unconstitutional. We have no theology departments in any state university. That is funny somehow, because the socialistic state of Slovenia, for instance, which is under socialistic government, but still has theology departments in all its universities. So somehow the American bourgeoisie is even further developed than some of these socialistic states. So, but nevertheless, it was, of course, very painful, because Father Harden was a very devoted teacher. He taught huge classes. He had written enough books, more than anybody else, to receive tenure, and he did not receive tenure. And he was used to bring his own successor into the university, that means me. And he did not know this, and I did not know that, and so on. And so that was somewhat a painful experience. So, but the Father Harden story shows somehow what this right-wing tendency in the Roman Catholic Church is like when it comes down to the diocesan level, or to the level of immediate operations.
Yeah, and speaking about that time period, that's the next section we want to go to is basically from 1981 to 2005, where in 1981, Pope John Paul II called Ratzinger to Rome. From what I understand, it took 3 times, and the third time was an order to serve as the prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith, better known as the Roman Inquisition, as you talked about, which Ratzinger would serve until he was elected Pope in 2005. Besides the papacy, this was his most controversial position, as he had to defend orthodoxy, interrogate potential issues of heresy and other forms of religious indifferentism. Chief among his targets, of course, was the liberation theology and liberation theologians, the foundations of which were laid down by the 1973 book, a Theology of Liberation, written by the Peruvian theologian and philosopher Gustavo Gutierrez. Liberation theology became especially important in Latin America in the 1980s, as it brought together Marxist class analysis with Catholic theology, at a time when Latin America was a battleground, an active battleground. To be all honest about it, it was an active battleground for the Cold War between the capitalist West and its allies, and the Soviet Union and its allies. Among those censored or stripped at this time of their license to teach were eminent theologians, some of you have already mentioned, such as Hans Küng, Leonardo Boff, Matthew Fox, for instance, and many others whom Ratzinger believed strayed too far away from orthodoxy. For this and other reactionary actions, he was, of course, called God's Rottweiler. As a Catholic intellectual, with a license to teach Catholic sacred theology, what was it like in the 1980s teaching about the horrors of what was happening in Latin America, predominantly by the US and its allies, against Catholic theologians or peasants, but oftentimes against nuns and priests, while at the same time being under the watchful eye of Joseph Ratzinger's Inquisition?
So he was also called the Panzergeneral, which was, of course, unfair. And so we want to be just and loving as much as possible. Let me go back for a moment to the reasons which were given when he finally resigned from the papacy, which was unusual. It had not happened for over 500 years. And what were the reasons? Maybe that throws some light on what else he did there. So the reasons were given that he was old. Well, I mean, there had been innumerable old popes, and they all stayed to the end, particularly his immediate predecessor. So then that the Swiss Guard had discovered that he was exhausted. Well, I'm quite sure that a lot of popes had been exhausted before. And then the people suggested that he should get some help and that some of his work should be done by others, as it has always happened. So, but that was not done. So what was it then, really? The bishops here, the conservative bishops, insist that it was old age, but I think it's not an adequate explanation. The explanation seems to be rather that the church has been in real crisis, not only since the Reformation, but particularly since the Enlightenment. So since the bourgeois Enlightenment of Voltaire and Rousseau, and the Marxist Enlightenment, of course, up from Marx up to Lenin, and then the Freudian Enlightenment with all the Freudians who followed. These were very serious things which already very early on, the great philosopher, maybe the greatest modern philosopher, Hegel, discovered that there was danger there, and that it could very well mean the end of Western Christianity or the end of Christianity. And Hegel did not want to end his philosophy of religion with this harmony, with this statement that the realization of the church was also its end. He reminded people that Jesus had founded the church and that the doors of hell would not overwhelm it, and that the kingdom of God had been established from the beginning. And so Hegel was a believer. He believed that the church would continue, but he had to admit that there was a disharmony going on there, that there was a real threat there in the Enlightenment. And at the same time that he appreciated the Enlightenment, he also discovered the dialectics of the Enlightenment, namely that something went wrong with the Enlightenment, that it turned against itself, that it became positivistic, and then prepared even fascism. So what one could say is that Pope Benedict then, being called into this situation after John Paul II, who played an eminent political role in that he gave money, which he received in the West, to the Solidarity Union, which then overthrew the socialistic government in Poland. So that made him tremendously popular and also rich in a certain sense, so that he could do all his travels and all this. So, and so the question was now how the new Pope Benedict, how he should deal with this antagonism between the religious and the secular, between the sacred and the profane, which had so unbelievably deepened since the Reformation and up to the different forms of enlightenment. And so he had, of course, been trained in scholasticism. So that would have been the natural paradigm to use in order to encounter all these difficulties. But there in scholasticism, he had written his dissertation about Bonaventura. Bonaventura was a very warm stream fellow in scholasticism, Platonic and Franciscan, and a very loving and loving person who saw the Trinity in every object of nature and the Trinitarian structure, the dialectical structure in everything in the human world. And but Ratzinger wrote his dissertation not in defense of Bonaventura, but against Bonaventura. And one of the directors in his committee, doctoral committee, sharply attacked him for this treatment of Bonaventura, so much so that his examen was almost in jeopardy. So nevertheless, here this is the issue that now, during the council, somehow the church became aware that the scholastic paradigm, in spite of Neo-Thomism and so on, was not adequate any longer. And so that he saw as well, and so he changed from the scholastic paradigm to the patristic paradigm. So the patristic paradigm was the one with which the church dealt with the Roman world, with the pagan world, with the pre-Christian world. So in that sense that the fathers, the church fathers, somehow separated Christianity from the Roman Empire, that it was something different in a certain way. So that the monasticism came up, the vows came up and so on. Hierarchical structure was strengthened and so on. So that was a paradigm which was adequate for antiquity. And scholasticism was a paradigm which was adequate for the Middle Ages. But neither of these two paradigms were adequate for modernity. That was the problem. After he tried powerfully, in a certain sense, he instigated stronger than ever before the antagonism to the modern world. His predecessor had said that in the case of Galileo Galilei, that maybe the Inquisition was a little bit wrong too. But now he asserted again that the Inquisition was right and that Galileo was wrong and so on. So he was not invited anymore to speak at the university in Rome, in the state university. He was not allowed to speak there anymore. So he deepened the dichotomy between the world, in spite of the fact that the council had said the church should be open toward the modern world, should have discourse with the modern world. He did the exact opposite of it. So a fair deal would have been if he had said, well, of course, Galileo Galilei was 70 years old. He was a scientist. He was a little bit arrogant, and not only a little bit, probably a little bit too much arrogant. And he looked at the fathers of the Inquisition and said, you are children, you are naive, you know nothing, and so on. Well, that was not the right thing to provoke an authority. And the fathers of the Inquisition, of course, had also something in mind. It had been taught before, the heliocentric system. Copernicus went to a pope 70 years earlier and told the pope about the theory, and the pope accepted it. But in the 70 years now, the Reformation broke out, and the church was shaken to its foundations, and people became neurotic. So suddenly they could not accept anymore a theory which they had accepted 70 years earlier. But even if they knew somehow that it was true what Galileo said, they needed time. They needed time to prepare the people for turning everything upside down. The sun goes up and down in the Old Testament, the New Testament, and everywhere else. And suddenly somebody said that the earth turned instead. And so that was somewhat shocking. They were afraid that people would lose their faith or whatever, which they had to protect. The Inquisition, even such horrible things, one has to, historically, one has to look at it in a more adequate sense. The Inquisition had a good goal. It wanted to keep the church united. Jesus had predicted that if the church would not be united, it would threaten its truth. And so they wanted to unite it, but they used bad means for a good goal, in spite of the fact that they condemned such a behavior in theory. So, and so they invented even waterboarding, which then was inherited by the SS, and then was continued by the CIA, and then was stopped by Obama, but will still go on and be outsourced to Egypt and Romania. So these are dark, is a dark background, but it doesn't help when one plays out one against the other, but one has to try to understand both sides and their limitations and their morality or immorality or whatever, and say, okay, so Galileo should have behaved a little bit better. And finally, he won anyway. He got house arrest. They didn't torture. He was never tortured, but he was not martyr material like others. And so he was frightened of it, as everybody would be. So he had house arrest, but his daughter took his book with all the heresies in it, and it was published in Holland. So it came out anyway, and so on. So that is the background about my situation. So I have remained a member of good standing in the Catholic Church. Nobody ever took my licentiate away, the license to teach Catholic theology. I did teach Catholic theology in Europe and then in Baltimore in Catholic institutions. And I then did, when Western suddenly had a theology department, I taught it here as well. Then finally, Western found out that it couldn't be done. There could be no theology department. They changed it into a religion department. But I stayed. I had no problem to teach the religious studies and also maintain, describe when that was the theme or that was the discipline, then also to teach Catholic theology or Protestant theology as well. As a matter of fact, I went even to East Germany, the German Democratic Republic, and in one of the cities, one of the universities in Rostock, who hadn't seen a Catholic theologian for 500 years. They didn't even know what kind of an animal I was. But I taught there again and again, Protestant theology, Catholic theology in the Protestant department. and we were able to put light on a lot of things which had happened there in these 500 years since Luther. So now, as far as the controls are concerned and so on, it happened once with the bishop, well, the first bishop of Kalamazoo, who was a very open man and belonged not exactly to the authoritarian type, and because of that had his own problems. And he invited even the faculty of Western Michigan University for a supper one day, and in order to show his openness and friendliness and so on. Unfortunately, then in the end, he said that he alone had the truth, and that didn't land very well. But at least he tried. And so we had many discussions with each other. But coming from Rome, he had to ask me one day that what I thought about not birth control. It was not birth control. It was it was abortion. It was the abortion issue, which was suddenly moved into the center of Catholic attacks on the state. And so the bishop went to Father John, who was the head of the student parish on campus, and he refused. He refused to ask me, and he had always some problems with the bishop, and therefore volunteered in the army, became an army chaplain, and went to Vietnam even. So nevertheless, the bishop finally said he would fire him if he wouldn't obey. And so he did ask me and what I thought about abortion. And I said that I was against abortion, that I had 8 children and it didn't look like abortion. And but that the council had said that we should be open to the modern world and should have discourse with the modern world. So we should have discourse with the modern world about abortion. And if the modern world stresses the conscience side, the individual side, the woman's side, the woman's right over her body and her decisions and so on, then I think that should be taken very seriously, because that had been discovered before in the Roman Catholic Church as well, where Thomas of Aquinas taught, surprisingly enough, he taught that on Judgment Day, Catholics would be judged not according to the teaching of the church, but according to the dictates of their conscience. Thomas of Aquinas was 3 times condemned by the Inquisition before he was canonized as a saint. So but this was not taught very much, and still is not taught sufficiently. There is on one side the objective teaching, there's on the other side the individual and the individual's rationality and freedom and conscience, and both sides have to be seen. So I said, let's discuss with the modern world, and I personally was against abortion, but I was also against the criminalization of abortion, because before Roe versus Wade, it had been criminalized, and it was pushed into the underground, and the rich could go to Japan and to Sweden and to Norway and get their abortions, and the poor had to take clothes hangers and kill the embryo and themselves in the process. So, and it was much more important to discover the causes of the high abortion rate, if it was psychological, economic, moral, or whatever, and then to remove those causes as much as possible. Maybe have family allowances or family wages and so on. That would be a good thing to support people when they had too many children, or that they could educate them adequately and so on. So nevertheless, so that was an incident, but the bishop, of course, here in this country had no right to ask that question, but I did not mind to answer him. And he was quiet, the bishop was quiet afterwards. He seemed to be satisfied. I never heard about it again. So in Germany, it would have been different because the Vatican had treaty with Mussolini, and the Vatican also had a treaty with Hitler, the Reichskonkordat, which today is still valid. And this Reichskonkordat allowed the Catholic Church to have religion teachers, to have theology in state institutions. And later on, they, of course, cheated with their own Reichskonkordat, but they continued to pay the priests. And the priests became army chaplains. Thousands of army chaplains marched with the 4 million Europeans into Russian territory and killed 26 million Russians and 6 million Jews and so on. So they were very loyal. The Bishop Wu was the director of my seminary and who married me later on. He had been an army chaplain there, and he was not supposed to fight, but he was sitting on the back of a tank. So enthusiastic he was in conquering communism, and froze his feet off there and had to be operated without anesthesia. But without anesthesia, also 25,000 children were machine gunned down, and he was standing there and just prayed his rosary. And so was this Protestant colleague who didn't do much more and couldn't do anything, not only physically immediately, but they were bound by the empire concordat, which is still at work today. So good it was. So nevertheless, this I didn't have any difficulties as such. I was never on the side of the Joseph Ratzinger. I was always on the side of his opponents. That means Gregory Baum or Hans Küng. We were all friends, and that is also true for Baptist Metz, very good friends. And he was not only the father of the new political theology. That means first time that political theology in Catholicism was on the side not of feudal lords and not of the bourgeoisie, but on the side of the workers. And out of this political theology on the left then developed the liberation theology of Boff and so on. And so Ratzinger then used his power in Munich that Baptist Metz could not get the prestigious chair in the University of Munich, which Guardini had before, which he could have used in order to spread his new political theology, which was in opposition to Carl Schmitt, who was Hitler's Jewist and was Hitler's political theologian, and gave speeches all through the 12 years of Nazism, for Nazism and so on, and did not convert after the war. He got no salary. He did not let himself be denazified. Finally, he got a salary anyway, and had great influence after the war. And all our libraries are full of his books, and he was studied everywhere in the United States and in Canada and so on. So that was a traditional political theology. That was a right-wing political theology. And Metz developed an opportunity on the other side, on the side of the exploited and the oppressed and so on. And so somehow Baptists never forgave Ratzinger for this decision, not to let him have this opportunity. And Ratzinger even came to the birthday of Metz in Münster, but even there, Baptist was very reserved and refused to just let it go and be good friends again and so on. He took it very, very seriously. And so that was not only Ratzinger's opposition against Gregory Baum, but also then, of course, against the liberation theologians who had been his students. That means Metz's students in Munich, and who then spread this liberation theology and became martyrs for this theology. 70,000 people of the Christian community were martyrized in El Salvador alone. 6 Jesuits and their housekeepers were murdered. a Jesuit usually has a theology degree, and then he studies some other discipline. He becomes a medical doctor, he becomes an economist, and so on. So all those who were killed in El Salvador, the Jesuits, had all an economic degree, and they looked at the coffee production, and they looked at what they earned, if that was a family wage, and then how much the coffee was when it was sold in the States, and how high the profit was. And they organized the workers so that they could push their wage up, and that means, of course, to lower the profit on the other side, and so they were killed. And before that, of course, Romero had been killed, had been assassinated because he told the army that they should not fight in this unjust war. And but that Romero finally, under Pope Francis, was then canonized, shows the shift, the strong shift which took place between the two papacies. So that was a good gesture, that the church was not on the side of the fascist state, but that it was rather on the side of the workers, on the side of the poor. And that was a new spirit which had taken place in the church. And of course, Francis was in the running already after the death of the previous Pope, John Paul II. But somehow the cardinals thought that maybe Joseph Ratzinger would be good at the next, when they say today, between a high level papacy and a normal one, he needed Ratzinger in order to make the transition. Well, I don't know if that providence was there before or if it was invented afterwards, but that is some saying in Fox News and also in the Eternal Word television network, which represents the Ratzinger line, and now, of course, remembers him. By the way, also the Eternal Word station does good things. So its connection with Fox News is what makes it problematic, and it's propaganda on the right. But there are two Jesuits who are not liberation theologians, but one of them is a great historian who can even celebrate the Mass in Aramaic, in the language of Jesus. And the other one is a specialist in science and has learned the sciences all by heart. And some of his answers are adequate. And both are very learned and decent people. So back to your question, I did not have to suffer in any way. The only incidence was the abortion issue, but there was never any attempt to change my teaching from one side or the other. That means both sides, the state and the church, were fair and were open and were tolerant. And I always was very, very grateful for this. Now, I was very active in the student movement. That is another chapter.
It's interesting that, people always talk about when Oscar Romero was canonized as some kind of proof of the more quote unquote liberal Pope Francis. And we also have to remember that he canonized Pope Paul VI on the same day. And other commentators would say, well, this is a balancing out between, Romero, who's more on the left, and Paul, who's more on the right, and the conservative. And they forget that Romero himself was actually quite conservative. It just happened to be that his flock, his priests, his parishioners were being massacred left and right in El Salvador. And he made that, appeal for El Salvadorian, as you said, soldiers not to fight the war, and then begged Americans to stop sending the weapons to the war. I was there, and I believe it was just after I arrived in Rome, just after the canonization of those two, because the flags were still up on St. Peter's. But I want to move to the next topic within the grand,
Let me just maybe add one thing to it, that Francis, of course, has his own black background or things he is sorry about. And so when his state became fascist, of course, then his liberation theologians among his Jesuit brothers even became threatened very much. And some of them charged him later on that he did not do enough in order to protect them. He celebrated the Mass with one of them in St. Georgen near Frankfurt, a Jesuit place, Jesuit college or university. And but he never did with the others, so they remained unreconciled. And so whatever he does today with China or other issues is somehow an attempt to make things good, which were done wrong at that time. And there I have to say, since I grew up for 12 years under fascism, one should never sit in judgment over those people who have become weak or did not act adequately or whatever, because the fascist system is an authoritarian system, and it's unbelievably brutal, and it can psychologically put great fear into people, and it needs great fortitude in order to resist this. So one must be adequate in one's judgment if one wants to do it, and see how unbelievably difficult it is for nonconformists in the system of any kind to resist it, or even to show displeasure with it or whatever. So there in Germany, I suffered all kinds of pressures from all sides. So that was no comparison what came later on. So therefore, if one talks about the past of the Pope or the past of or mayor or whatever, one must appreciate what it took for a bishop who was in the tradition to cooperate with right-wing governments and fascist states, suddenly to say that he will not go to the inauguration of the president or or the head of the Arena party, the fascist party, and so on. I had two nuns who were in my class in Maryknoll, where I taught every summer, and both of them were among the 5 nuns who were raped and robbed and killed in El Salvador. And they were beautiful, beautiful women. My task there was to tell them what socialism is, because nobody in the States knows what socialism is, so that they would be prepared when they go into the missions down there. And so I did this every summer, and in Catholicism and socialism and so on. And then, interesting enough, when they came back again, the Maryknoll order wanted them to go back to their families and to stay with their families and make contact with their families again and so on. But then after they had been with their families for 3 days, they all left again, because the families didn't understand what they were telling them about El Salvador or other states in Central America. And so they didn't feel good anymore at home, and so they left right away again and went back into the mission. So, and I tried both, and it was very difficult to make the sisters aware of socialism there, and then it was almost impossible to help the sisters to tell their story at home, because they were simply not believed because of the propaganda shield under which they find themselves all the time.
Yeah, last question on this part of his life. Late in his time as the prefect for the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, Ratzinger engaged in a pretty famous discourse with Jürgen Habermas about relativism, the Christian nature of Europe, the future of Islam in Europe, and as well as his reservations about this. This discussion was later published in 2005 in a book entitled The Dialectics of Secularization on Reason and Religion, and it was originally published in German by Herder Verlag, and then in English by Ignatius Press, in this book here. In 2005, which was the same year that he became Pope. What came out of this discourse? Is it fruitful for someone like Habermas, who claims to be religiously unmusical, as he says, to engage with someone who's that high in the Catholic institution, in this case, the prefect, Ratzinger? What came out of this?
Well, I think not much came out of it, but the Habermas has written now the book, and it ends up with a certain openness of the critical theory to which he belongs, of the Frankfurt School, and openness toward the religious side. So there was a change on the Marxist side and so on too. But I found out about it also in Croatia and also in Crimea and so on, that the Marxists had become more open for religion and for the possibility how it could possibly survive in classes or in a free society. So and he also was aware that religion, which would still be able in its communication, like the Mass or so, to make transcendence visible as breaking into the immanence of the secular world, and what that would mean if this transcendence would disappear completely, and what it would do to human reason if this transcendence, this challenge, would not any longer be there. So he was very close, Habermas was very close to Adorno. Now, Adorno made clear, non credo, I do not believe, in his discussions with my friends Walter Dirks and Eugen Kogon. So, but in spite of the fact that he did not believe, that means that the revelation which Judaism and Christianity present is too contradictory, so that he therefore waited for a better revelation, for a more adequate revelation, but and tried to translate certain elements in religion into the secular discourse. That had been done. The labor union, labor movement translated neighborly love into solidarity, for instance, or the idea of the almost perfect union, which we have here, was taken out of Christianity. In general, the whole program of the bourgeois Enlightenment and the later Enlightenments, the democracy containing the element of equality, of freedom, of brotherhood, sisterhood, and so on, these were all translations from the religious sides into the secular side. And so also Marcuse was asked by his students in the German Democratic Republic if religion would still be there in the free society, in the classless society. And he said yes, and because he said yes, they didn't like him anymore. But he thought of a prophetic type of a religion, of the religion of a Moses who liberated his people from the slavery, from the slave masters and so on, and a God who was on the side of the slaves against their masters and so on. So this revolutionary turnaround and so on, that such a religion would certainly still be present also in the free society, because it will have its own dialectic to fall back again where it came from, and there it was, these revolutionary elements were necessary. So, and he then left the German Democratic Republic and went to the German Federal Republic, to Tübingen, where he died.
Yeah, it seems to me when I read this text, and I've written on this book before, that, you know, one of the things that people say about Ratzinger is that he had a papacy of reason, for instance, which wasn't new. He was constantly arguing about the need for reason, even before he was elected Pope in 2005. You know, so you need reason and faith. You couldn't have one or the other. Reason, you know, without faith, you know, it can become so distorted you can justify anything with it. Faith without reason becomes fanatical. It becomes unbound to reality, for instance. And here's Habermas, on the other hand, saying, okay, we're as philosophers, we're for reason. Reason should be our guide in this world. But yet we can't, you know, somehow enter into that closed semantic universe of the faith community. We can't enter into that. For a lot of people like Habermas, religiously unmusical, they simply can't believe it anymore. But as you said, it seems like there's some kind of semantic, semiotic material within religion that can be translated into post-metaphysical language so that it can enter into the sphere, the public sphere of which things are debated via reason. And that seems to be like a bridge point between this very conservative cardinal, in this case at that time, and this very eminent Frankfurt School philosopher. This idea that they both can exist, but they both have to talk in this kind of language that they both can understand.
Yeah. Well, there's one thing is wrong, and that is with reason. So the theme of Walter Dirksen, Eugen Kogan, and Adorno in 1958 in Münster, they had a public discussion, and the theme was revelation and autonomous reason. There you have the problem, autonomous reason. The reason in the patristic model was not autonomous. It was led by faith. It was led by the church. It was led by the hierarchy. And the reason of scholasticism, in spite of the fact of Thomas Aquinas and Aristotle, which he received from Averroes, from the Muslim Enlightenment, otherwise Europe would not have known anything of Aristotle. So, but in spite of the fact of Aristotle, that reason of Thomas Aquinas was not autonomous. So what has happened in modernity and why Pope Benedict finally had to resign, why he came to the end of his knowledge and his wits in spite of his intelligence, that was that this reason, this modern reason, had emancipated itself from the guidance of the church. That means in the church community, suddenly three different groups appeared. One of naive, not in the bad sense now, but in a good sense, naive believers who just took the church and the gospels and so on as they are there. And then people of education, that means enlightened people, who operated on the level of analytical understanding. And then for Hegel, there was another group of philosophers of dialectical reason who could get the other two together. But the whole issue of reason now is what is misunderstood. So when Pope Benedict talks about reason, he means that reason which is obedient to faith, which is obedient to the church teaching office, the magisterium, and so on. But that modern reason has separated from itself. It reflects upon itself. It reflects on its own autonomy. And it also reflects on its own dialectics, namely its own weakness, its own finitude, and so on. It does not set up itself as something divine or whatever, but it sets itself up as a weak human capacity which does what it can do with the weak forces and energies it has. So here, when Pope Benedict looked through the patristic paradigm, scholastic paradigm, and then looked at what Habermas thought or Adorno thought about reason, then there was somehow a lack of connection between the two sides.
Yeah, so moving on to Ratzinger's papacy from 2005 to 2013, he was elected Pope on April 19th, 2005, and took the name Benedict XVI in honor of Benedict XV, who guided the church during World War I, and also in Benedict of Nursia, the patron saint of Europe. The latter, according to Ratzinger, to evoke the Christian roots of Europe, Benedict being the patron saint of all Europe. Often called the Panzer Pope at this time, as you had mentioned before, his papacy is marked by numerous controversies. And I think, right now with his death being so recent, all the shows are talking about, the greatness of the Pope, his theology that he left behind, where he guided the church in times of trouble and things like that. But it's understandable that people want to do that, for someone who recently passed away. But it's also the case that as dialecticians, we have to see the night side of Benedict and where he was very controversial. So one of the things I remember, I was in one of your courses at the time, was the restoration of 4 formerly excommunicated Holocaust-denying bishops in 2009. The men all belonged to the Society of St. Pius X, which was founded in 1970 as an ultra-traditionalist protest against the Second Vatican Council. Ratzinger sought to regularize church relations with the society after they had been sidelined in many cases and excommunicated. He also restored the claim that the Jews were responsible for the crucifixion of Jesus of Nazareth in the Good Friday and Easter Mass. That was, I remember them getting in a lot of trouble. There was a lot of critique of him for trying to regularize those who were on the far right and bring them back into the fold, especially when they had positions on the Holocaust. And in interviews with some of these priests or these bishops at the time, when they asked them about the Holocaust, had they changed their mind on it, they still did not believe the Holocaust happened, yet they had been brought back into the church by Ratzinger.
Yeah, one of those bishops came to Frankfurt to the airport and then made that statement that that he didn't believe in the Holocaust, that there were just a few hundred people who were killed or whatever, and that was very dangerous. He had to go back on the plane right away and fly to London, because in Germany it was a crime to deny the Holocaust. So yeah, and it is true, and the Pope was criticized, but he did not retract in any way. They were integrated back into the Roman Catholic Church. They were not excommunicated any longer. On the other hand, there were 90 people, 90 theologians who were critical of him, and none of them was taken back. The Hans Küng never was allowed to teach as a Catholic theologian again, and so on. And the Gregory Baum was excommunicated, and the liberation theologian, the father of the liberation theology, Metz, he got along somehow, but there were tensions all the time, and he, in any case, did not get to the chair, which was necessary in order to spread the new political theology against Carl Schmitt, who became more and more popular all the time in the Restoration period, the Adenauer Restoration period.
Another one of the issues that came up in 2006 was when what's commonly called the Regensburg Address, when he went back to the university to talk about his experiences there. And he gave a talk called Faith, Reason in the University, Memories and Reflections. And there he quotes it was a Byzantine individual, I think it was a Byzantine ruler, who said something about, show me what Islam has ever brought to the world, and I'll show you a faith that is essentially spread by the sword. And of course, that quote from this individual went around the world and sparked massive protests against Pope Benedict. And I don't think anybody bothered to really read the address or to listen to what he was trying to say, because I think his main point there was the danger of de-Hellenization, the danger of even if it's not autonomous reason, just the danger of excommunicating reason from faith. And that was some way of explaining in 2006, when he gave this address, how religion can become violent, become fanatical, can become pathological when it's not in some kind of ways interrogated by faith, even if not, or by reason, even if not by autonomous reason. What are your thoughts on that? Do you remember that happening?
Yeah. I think the Pope wanted to continue the tradition, to be open for Judaism and to be open to Islam, for the Abrahamic religions. And I could not think that he would continue old prejudices against Islam, that they were violent or that they were fanatic or whatever. I think that is definitely a misunderstanding of him. But his attack was against modernity. One could say, that Islam is closer to the bourgeois Enlightenment than Christianity is, but I think the Pope was not aware of that issue. So I don't think that he was opposed to or participated in the general prejudices now in Europe because of all this immigration and so on. I don't think that he would play along with this. He had some open things, of course, for modernity. He was for the environmental issues. He gave a speech for environmentalism in the German parliament. So he had some openings, but the overall general issue was against modernity, and the Hellenization is, of course, also a part of this modernity, to move away from Aristotle, move away from Plato. Even Bertolt Brecht there moved away from Aristotle in terms of art or so. And that is Athens is very important for Catholicism, as is Jerusalem. And Jerusalem and Athens and Rome are the three pillars on which Roman Catholicism is based. And he was certainly for preservation of all three pillars in the church. So in the form of scholasticism and in the form of patristics.
Yeah, and soon after that controversy, he went to Turkey and visited the religious authorities of Turkey, and they had very fruitful conversations together. And it reminded me of when St. Francis went to Damietta in Egypt and talked to the Sultan Malik of Kamel. They had problems with the world, but they spoke the same theological language. And it didn't appear to me at that time, or even now looking back at it, that he was engaged in some kind of public relations or whatnot. But he also said in conversation with, Catholicism and Judaism, that we can't cover up our differences. We have to be honest. We disagree on these things, but, we want to focus on the commonalities and be brotherly and sisterly and love each other. But we also have to be honest about where we disagree. And I think he was very much that way with Islam, with the Muslim world. But hopefully, well, at least at that time, I don't think a lot of people wanted to hear that, or at least it was politicized as part of the clash of civilization narrative, that now this German Panzer Pope is attacking the Islamic world, like Jyllands-Posten in Denmark with their cartoons of Muhammad and things like that. And that was kind of brought into that discourse, what he said, when I don't think that was his point at all.
Yeah, but as an authoritarian personality, of course, he stresses the differences as well. And people may feel sometimes, maybe when they are friendly, that they are not so pushing on exclusion. It's a matter, the authoritarian personality is exclusive. The democratic personality is inclusive. So it is possible that an authoritarian personality is distrusted because of its general tendency toward exclusion, toward differentiation, toward otherness, these are the others, and so on. But let's say for a moment that he was honest, and I have no doubt that he should not have been honest, that he wants to have a good relationship to the other Abrahamic religions, as long as one does not include them in any way, as long as the difference is emphasized as well.
Yeah, and that kind of ties into the last of the questions. Well, I got a couple more questions, but of the papacy portion, and that is his throughout his writings in the last few decades, he talks a lot about the dictatorship of relativism. That, you know, somehow modern society, specifically Europe, Western culture, Western society, is now under the spell of relativism, where there is no truth anymore. You know, there are these little protocol sentences, little facts that we've talked about, you know, this is south, this is north, this is night, this is day, those facts are whatever, but there's no ultimate truth anymore. Everything is relative. And he saw that as a new form of dictatorship, a new authoritarian ideology where truth has to be defended, have to be rescued. But of course, it comes down to whose truth, as always. Mm-hmm. And so I think he had that in common with people, other religious voices, whether in the Muslim world or in the Jewish world, that are also critics of modernity, that they see relativism as a problem. Because with relativism, you can simply say, going back to his life or your early life in the Third Reich, that, you know, it's whether life is worth living is relative to what tribe you come from, what race you are, right? Things like that. Whereas if you're coming from the position of the imago Dei, or the image of God, that all humans are made in the image of God, that's not a relativistic statement. That's an absolute statement, right? And that seems to be, in his authoritarian kind of very conservative way, that seems to be something that I think people on even the left could agree with, that there is truth. We're not in this Trumpian post-truth world, even though people like to think we are. Truth still remains. I think for me, that's something I can still agree with them, even if I can't agree with them on all of his truth claims.
Yeah. Well, certainly truth was still very important for the critical theorists of society. You know? So they formulated it negatively. So they were fighting against the untruth. That means they de-ideologized. They defined ideology as false consciousness, as cover up of particular economic interests, or simply as the untruth. So for them, the truth was important. But so the question is, what is the content of that absolute truth, which Ratzinger stood up for? And very often people are formalistic and emphasize the form, truth, and never say anything about the content. I think the content of Ratzinger's truth was the God who was reconciled with himself and with nature and with the human world through the sacrifice of Christ. And through that sacrifice of Christ, man's sin was forgiven and he could be resurrected from the dead and so on. So that was the absolute truth. Now, there is, of course, a lot of people who cannot accept this, but one could also see to what extent, for instance, the Abrahamic religions have that in common or do not have that in common. The one God is in common to all of them, all three of them. So otherwise we have in the Eastern religions, it's more pantheistic, but this oneness element is there too. So, if one would emphasize content more, I think that people don't talk about the content because then it becomes really problematic. If they remain formal, and that's a general bourgeois formalism, if you remain formal, you can't get through everything. So it gets really problematic when the content comes up, what that really means, that God is reconciled with himself. That presupposes a dichotomy. And Jakob Böhme talks about Lucifer as the predecessor of the Logos, where it becomes very clear the antagonism between, but you have it in also in John, in the first chapter, there is God on one side, and then there is the Logos, or there is Son, and there's the Father, and there's the Son, and so on. It is this antagonism which is reconciled, and at the same time also the God and nature reconciled, and the human world, but in such a way that human beings as individuals and even as whole nations have to elevate themselves to that reconciled God. That is the task of world history and so on. So for many people, that may simply be too optimistic, like Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer would talk about the cursed optimism of Hegel and other Christians and so on. So, but whatever, you know, this is the issue now. If one talks about the dictatorship of relativism, that means everything goes and everything is flattened out, and there are no distinctions between good and evil anymore, and truth and untruth and so on. I mean, there is some justification, of course, for that. So there are modern people who are critical of modernism. There are enlighteners who are critical of the dialectic of enlightenment. If something has gone wrong with Christianity, something has gone wrong with the Enlightenment as well. It was not Freud's intention to have a type of oversexed type of society or whatever. Fromm was a very moral and strict person and so on. So what the Enlighteners wanted and what became of the Enlightenment may very often not be the same. So on both sides, I think it is good to be not only critical of the other, not only listen to the criticism of the other, but also be critical of themselves in the process. So reason, autonomous reason, has also at the same time to be critical of itself, but also faith has to be critical of itself as well. And you wrote that beautiful Festschrift there where the title indicates that religion criticizes the world, but the world also criticizes religion, and rightly so, and that this discourse must be carried on.
Critique of religion and religion's critique.
Right.
Yeah, it has to go both ways and try to understand both ways. I mean, once you get stuck in one side and only criticize the other, it becomes pathological, it becomes distortative. You should see them both. So here, the last question. Ratzinger or Benedict XVI's retirement from the papacy is the first in approximately 600 years, at least since Pope Gregory the 12th, who retired in 1415, and he did so to end the Western Schism. This retirement was praised by some as innovative, as something that probably should set a precedent for future popes, and it was criticized by others, especially in Germany, where I remember the phrase when it happened back in 2013, that it appeared that he climbed down from the cross, that this was what he was supposed to bear until his demise, but yet he climbed down from it. What are your thoughts on that? Do you think it was something good to have a pope who retires, as opposed to what happened with John Paul II, where he went into it even when he was in his last days, ill and frail, but yet still out there? Was it a good innovation by Benedict?
I think somehow Pope Francis has already signed his resignation papers from the very start. So he is willing, to resign when he thinks that his energies are not adequate anymore to the work which has to be done. And I think it is part of the authoritarian glorification of the authority, which sees in retirement some kind of a weakness, some kind of a desertion. Like he deserted the army, and he deserted the papacy and the church and so on. So yes, German cardinals even said, he tells the people who want to get divorced, stay on the cross, carry your cross, and you climb down from the cross and so on. So, but let me put it that way, the whole issue with, with his retirement, it is not enough to say simply is old or was weak or whatever. I think that it was a deeper type of a thing why he resigned, and that may make him a rather honest man in a certain sense. He saw that the paradigms which he used in order to encounter modernity and even make a last anti-modernist attack outside and inside of the church, that this had failed. And the question is then, if not patristic, if not scholastic, what then? Is there not anything? And there I always suggest, and I'm not alone, Karl Barth would suggest as well. Karl Barth thought that Hegel would be the new Thomas of Aquinas of the Protestants. And I always think that Hegel could be also the new Thomas of Aquinas for the modern people. So that means to accept the help of what was called German idealism or transcendentalism here with Emerson and so on. These people did make a serious attempt to rescue Christianity from the powers of enlightenment and also from the dialectic of enlightenment. That means like fascism and so on. So the Lateran Treaty would not have happened with Mussolini or the Reichsconcordat with Hitler and so on if they had gone this way. So to say that Hegel is responsible for Nazism and whatever, Hitler did not follow Hegel. Hitler rejected Hegel and dialectics. He followed Schopenhauer. And so these prejudices we have to somehow to get rid of. So the fundamental problem is who can help? It's not only the Roman Catholic Church, it's the other churches as well. Who can help Christianity? In that we may very well call it a deadly attack by the, because neither Freud is dead nor Marx is dead and so on. So because the reality is there, the Marx is not dead simply because the private appropriation of collective labor continues. It's the reality which is the problem. It's not Marx which is the problem. It's the schizophrenia of the modern personality which is the problem, not Freud. One charge is always the one who discovers something for what he discovers. But there were many people who discussed the private appropriation of collective labor. That was Adam Smith too, and Malthus and so on. They all were concerned with this. So the question is, how can the Christians find a paradigm which enables them adequately to understand what modernity is, and post-modernity now coming, and then to cooperate with it, to find ways to reconcile themselves with it without betraying what they call the truth, and recognize whatever truth there may be on the other side. So the issue, let's see, of the three vows of chastity, poverty, and obedience, and so on. That was great in patristic, was great in scholastics, and so on. But modern people have shifted, and they think not any longer that celibacy is holier than marriage. They think that marriage is the real ethical thing. Marriage and family and children and family love and so on. If I, for instance, had decided for ordination, it would have meant that my 8 children would never have been born. It would mean that I would not have had 14 grandchildren, or now the 6 great-grandchildren and so on. So there is a decisive shift that the very well marriage or family and so on may be the moral thing to do. The Enlightener thought that celibacy was unnatural. The idealists did not think it was unnatural, but they thought it was unethical. So, and that is something seriously to be considered. The other thing is also with poverty. The modernity means not poverty any longer, but an active life of production and so on and so on. And with obedience, not blind obedience any longer to the abbot or so, but as Hitler liked it very much, so but obedience in freedom. That means the free subjectivity out of its own rational convictions accepts something and is obedient to it. So if the state is rational in saying you should have a mask or whatever, then it is good for a free person to obey these laws of the state and so on. So these are more modern things where modernity separated itself more and more from the Middle Ages and antiquity, including the de-Hellenization problem that is part of it. So I would say so that the German idealism from Kant through Fichte and Schelling to Hegel. When I studied theology, there was only one professor who knew Kant and taught it in moral theology of all of them, and he was the most enlightened one. So, but all the others had no clue. So, but our philosophy department here at Western was the same issue. They had only one Kantian who was at the same time a postal worker, and they just hired him on the side. So, so there is help out there, and what is called German idealism, or also the Marxist tradition or the Freudian tradition, the hatefulness which one finds not only in Fox News but also in the Eternal Word and so on, the continual hatefulness against everything what is Marxist or whatever. It is simply blind. This hate is blinding people, and it has had so much bad effects. The whole thing why Christianity, Protestant and Catholics, marched with fascism into Russia and so on was their fear of communism, was their fear of Marxism. Their fear of Marxism drove them into the arms of fascism and does it again. So therefore, it is, I think that in this dilemma now, not having an adequate paradigm, which drove the Pope into early retirement, so that he was only 8 years Pope and 10 years in retirement and so on. That was decisive, but I think it could mean that we honor him in that too. If he really saw that these paradigms did not fit anymore and he had no new one to refer to, then it was the honest thing to do to resign. And that could then really be seen as something honorable.
All right. That was an excellent discourse today about this issue of Pope Benedict XVI. I think his pontificate, even though it was, as you said, short, he had a longer retirement than he did in the papacy, that it will be not necessarily transformative, but it will be consequential in many ways. And so I think that's one of the things we'll have to do I'm a amateur Vatican watcher. You know, I go to Rome often. And
you are very good.
The history of the popes is always fascinating to me. So I'll continue to do this work, no doubt. So thank you very much for this wonderful discourse, Dr. Siebert.
You're welcome.